All right, hey guys, how's everyone doing? All right. If you hear any, I think my camera's shaking. If you hear any noise in the background, it's my kids FaceTiming their cousins. So if you hear loud stuff in the background, it's probably them. Anyway, how's everybody doing? I'll give everybody a few minutes to log on. We have a few people on right now. So if the camera quality and sound quality is not that great, my apologies. But I started using my phone to film the videos, but I can't live stream from my phone. You have to have 1,000 subscribers to be able to do that, and I don't. So that is what it is. But we'll do what we can with what we've got. So who all's on right now? If you can comment. If not, I know if you don't have a channel, you can't comment. So if you can't, no worries. But if you can, feel free to fire off a comment. If you have questions, you can just ask as we go. So they'll pop up on my feed and I can see them and I'll answer them as I go. So look forward to doing this. I'm excited to have a live stream going with you guys. I'm going to give it about another 40 seconds just for more people to log in case they were having any issues getting logged on or if there's any lag in the Wi-Fi so that they're able to get on. So we'll start in about 30 seconds. While we're waiting, I just want to say I'm really proud of how you all have been doing with this distance learning thing. You guys are knocking it out of the park. You're crushing it. So you guys are completing your assignments on time, and you're doing good work, and I really appreciate it. So I'm proud of you guys, and just continue the great work that you've been doing. About 10 more seconds before we start the content here. All right, and let's hop into it now. So we're going to be talking about the Cold War and different presidents' responses to the Cold War. So the real focus today is going to be on JFK's response to the Cold War because his response is different than that of his predecessors. So we're going to focus on that. However, to do that, we need to talk about Truman's response and we need to talk about Eisenhower's response just so we can compare and contrast them with Kennedy's response. So with Truman, and we've talked about this, and this is reviewed to some extent, but Truman's response to the Cold War is not all that successful. So first thing, Truman's Cold War approach is initially going to be getting tough with the Soviet Union. So he feels that FDR was a little too soft on the Soviet Union when they were meeting together during World War II. So FDR really didn't put a lot of pressure on the Soviets to not take over different parts of Europe. I mean, they talked about it, and there was the issue of Poland and whether Poland would have a communist government or a pro-Western government. And then there were the issues of Germany, partitioning Germany, and reparations and things like that. So Truman's going to meet, and Truman has his get tough policy. And Truman's get tough policy, he touts this. He's like, I've got this. I'm going to stick it to the Soviets. I've got this locked down. I'm going to get pretty much everything I want. So he was making sure to leave a little bit of wiggle room. He's like, I'm going to be able to get about 85% of what I want from the Soviets. I'm going to be able to get that accomplished. So he has it's called the Potsdam Conference. He meets with the Soviets and he pushes in his mind really hard and then starts making all kinds of concessions. So his 85% that he thought he was going to get looks a whole lot more like less than 50% of what he wanted to get. So it's kind of embarrassing to Truman how he said he was going to do so well negotiating with the Soviets and actually ends up not doing all that awesome negotiating with the Soviets at the Potsdam Conference. So as he transitions away from that, a couple of things get developed under Truman Doctrine. And every president has what's called a doctrine. If you remember back to Monroe Doctrine, which is very simply put the idea that Europe needs to stay out of the Americas, and it's called Monroe Doctrine. This is in the 1800s. It's called Monroe Doctrine because it was under Monroe. All right. So similarly, we have Truman Doctrine, and Truman Doctrine, part of that is containment. It's the idea of keeping communism in as small of an area as possible. not letting it spread to new regions, because the idea was that spreads to new regions, then it's going to cause a domino effect where, like dominoes, boom, they all start to topple all the nations in the area where communism has come. So if one nation gets infected with communism, all the other ones are going to get what Truman would probably describe as the disease of communism. So the example of containment in action under Truman is going to be the Korean War, where communism comes to North Korea and America gets involved internationally in a war, in the Korean War, to stop communism from spreading all the way to the whole Korean peninsula. So we're willing to put boots on the ground, put soldiers in Korea, and fight against Korea and eventually the Chinese, because China helps Korea, North Korea, and invades and pushes American forces back down into South Korea. And then we have to put another very concerted effort to push the Chinese and the North Koreans back to the armistice line. The Korean War is not super successful. It's not a loss, but we just fight to a standstill. So it's not a decisive win. And we're coming off the back of World War II, where we had a very decisive win against the Germans and against the Japanese. So this is just not seen as very successful as far as Truman's policies. So Truman's Cold War policies, they're in name, they're aggressive. And as far as the Korean War is concerned, it's aggressive, but it's just not very successful. So then that brings us to Eisenhower. So Eisenhower, we have a military man, a general, who becomes a president. So he takes aggression to the next level, right? He's thinking of this Cold War as a war, not as a political tension or some diplomatic disagreement. So when Eisenhower gets involved in the Cold War, one of his Cold War approaches is massive retaliation. And that's the idea of, if you drop one bomb on us, Soviet Union, one nuclear bomb, we're going to drop all of our nuclear bombs on you. Right? So that's massive retaliation. It's also known as mutually assured destruction, because the idea was, if they drop one, we drop all, then they drop all, and everybody gets nuked. And this is kind of where, if you remember, this is last week where I had you guys watch the duck and cover video. This is where that comes from. Duck and cover is during this era of nuclear tension, where people were concerned that at any moment the Soviet Union could drop bombs on America. And the Soviets were concerned that at any moment America could drop bombs on them. And another thing that occurs under Eisenhower is the idea of brinkmanship, which I described earlier as nuclear chicken. So it's the idea of, you push your opponent to the brink of war to get what you want. And you're willing to go all the way as close to that line as you can without actually having full-on war. And the idea that Eisenhower had was, the Soviets are going to blink first, and we're going to show that we're strong, and we're going to make advancements in the Cold War by using brinkmanship. But it's a dangerous game to play, because if you call their bluff and they're not bluffing, then you've got war. And in his administration, Eisenhower did make some attempts at peace with the Soviets, but as we had talked about, this is just kind of blown away by the U2 incident. And I can't say the U2 incident without thinking of the band U2, which I'm not sure if some of you even know who U2 is as a band, but it's also a type of plane. It's a spy plane that the Americans had, and we were flying a U-2 spy plane over Soviet airspace, and the plane was shot down. And this is under Eisenhower, and this is while we had a meeting scheduled for peace talks with the Soviets. And so we're just starting to make progress, and boom, the U-2 incident happens, and all that progress is just wiped away, and the Soviets are even madder at us. So Truman's ideas are containment and get tough, and it doesn't really work super well. Eisenhower has brinkmanship and massive retaliation. It doesn't really work as far as calming the Cold War. So in comes Kennedy. And I'm going to pause just for a second before I get to Kennedy to see if anyone has questions. Feel free, to type them in the comments. I'll wait for about 10 more seconds. And if you have a question while I'm talking, just fire away. Okay, so into Kennedy. So Kennedy comes in, and when Kennedy becomes president, his idea is the flexible response. Now, every time I say this, I'm afraid people are going to think weak response. Flexible response is not a weak response because Kennedy does build up the military, particularly our special forces. And we do have some conflict in which Kennedy takes a very strong stance, but also is diplomatic about it, right? So this is strength without being overly aggressive. So the flexible response is let's talk about peace, let's not escalate, but let's be ready if there is escalation. Okay, so some things with the flexible response that show our ability to be aggressive without being overly aggressive. One thing would be a positive would be the handling of the Cuban Missile Crisis. So Cuba falls to communism and they have ties to the Soviet Union. So the Soviets have nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is very close to America. At its closest point, it's about 90 miles away from Florida. And that means a missile can be launched from Cuba and hit Florida in about 5 minutes. Not good, not good at all. However, we have nuclear missiles in Turkey, so we have also a very short response time. And if we want to launch a missile from Turkey into the Soviet Union, it's also a very short launch time. So this makes both sides very uncomfortable. So we're both posturing very aggressively and Kennedy works very hard to de escalate this. So he ends up using the flexible response, negotiating the removal of our missiles from Turkey, standing down our missile program there, in exchange for the Soviets standing down their missile program in Cuba. So we were pretty close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the flexible response allows for this to be solved amicably without any nukes being launched. However, there is a not so great part of the flexible response, and that is going to be the Bay of Pigs invasion. So, one thing Kennedy had tried was he wanted to help some Cubans who had wanted to take over Cuba after it fell to communism. So, we as a military and as a nation agreed to support a bunch of rebels who are going to invade Cuba through the Bay of Pigs. The problem is their invasion goes very, very poorly. I mean, very poorly. I'm not really sure it could have gone a whole lot worse. They don't get much further than the beachhead. And as the invasion starts to fail, we had promised support, like air support to them. We bail. We just don't support them. So if you know anything about the military, one of the most powerful things that we have in our military is our Air Force. Air support is what means the difference a lot of times in conflict between winning and losing. And so these rebels don't have the air support they're promised, so they lose. And this looks bad for America in two ways. One way it looks bad is that, first of all, we're helping rebels invade a communist, a small communist nation, and they fail. So we can't even get that right. Internationally, it looks really bad. First of all, it looks bad because we're escalating, right? It's not direct war, it's indirect warfare where we're supporting a group that's going to fight against communists that the Soviets support. And we fail because they fail. So that looks bad. And secondly, it looks bad because we don't uphold our promise to give support to the rebels. So it looks bad on two fronts, and that's not a great reflection initially on the Kennedy administration. However, I'm not saying he doesn't recover. I'm just saying it's not great during the Bay of Pigs invasion. One other thing to mention during the Kennedy administration, as far as the Cold War is concerned, is the space race. So, with the space program, the Soviets had beat us to space as far as with a satellite to space. And also with a man to orbit the Earth in space, Yuri Gagarin. So we are behind in the space program, and so we want to be able to say we've done something exceptional to prove to the Soviets we have the economic power to fund a really stellar space program, pun intended. Um, Two, to show that we have the engineering, like aerospace engineering, and that we have the mathematical and scientific capabilities to make sure that we're able to do something extraordinary successfully. And that extraordinary thing that Kennedy wants is to put a man on the moon. So he wants to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade of the 60s. And unfortunately, Kennedy does not live to see this accomplished. He's assassinated in 63, and he doesn't see us put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. But through the Apollo space program, we show the world, and most importantly, we show the Soviets, that we are able to do something incredible in our space program. And by the way, if we have aerospace technology to land a man on the moon, you better believe our missile technology is really good, right? So that's another aspect of the space race, right? We're thinking, and America's thinking, great, there's a man on the moon, but there's the side of the military angle where if we can launch people to the moon and get them back, then we can launch a missile a much shorter distance. So that's the point of the space program. Also, it encourages America and it shows Americans, it raises morale in America and shows them that though the Soviets beat us with a man in space and they beat us with a satellite in space, we can beat them to a man on the moon. And that's something, by the way, they still haven't done. So it's an incredible accomplishment. So what I want you to get today, as far as Cold War responses, Truman tried containment, which I'm not going to say Kennedy isn't going to support, but he tried containment with the Korean War, and it was Truman doctrine that starts containment. Second of all, Eisenhower is much more aggressive as far as Cold War stance is, and Kennedy wants a more flexible response where we have a diplomatic approach, we have diplomatic channels open to the Soviets, where we're not being quite so forceful and we're willing to negotiate. So the big difference between Kennedy and his predecessors is this idea of much more openness to negotiate and not to strong arm. We're not posturing, we're not strong arming, we're actually deliberating, we're actually being diplomatic. All right. Any questions that you all have for me or any comments that you have for me? Okay, well, if you think of anything, please email me. I check my email very frequently. And again, I just want to reiterate, you guys are doing a great job. Keep up the really good work. I'm very proud of you guys. If at any point you have a question or anything, a concern, anything like that, please email me. I'll get back to you as soon as possible. All right, guys. Have a great day. And we'll do these again. I'm gonna have another live stream before the end of the week. All right. So really appreciate it. Enjoy your day, guys.